I'm Phil from Lightside Facts. Welcome to this channel. Did you know that history classes are often wrong? That historical facts are purely invented, modified and transformed over the centuries. Here are 5 examples that will amaze you. Are you ready to hear the truth? Fact in line number 1. Robin Hood existed. Good question, which I'd like to say is true. But it isn't. Tell me in the comments just below your opinion, your hope that it's true. I'm curious to know your answers about Robin Hood. I'll explain how this legend almost became a real character in people's minds. Stealing from the rich to help the poor, surrounded by his merry men, and constantly fighting Prince John the Landless and his treacherous henchman the Sheriff of Nottingham. Indeed, the reality is quite different. Robin Hood was first mentioned in 1228, in a judicial parchment. Indeed, a certain robot was imprisoned for non-payment of a debt or a fine. Until the end of the century, several administrative documents in Yorkshire also mentioned this character. The spelling varies from Robin Hood to Hobod depending on the text. Robot, as an itinerant rebel, must have acquired a certain notoriety in England, for as early as the 14th century, the first ballads featuring the legend of Robin Hood appeared. These poems are first mentioned in 1387 in Petro Plowman's Visio Wilhelmi, William's Vision of Piers Plowman, a text considered to be one of the first great works of English literature. With the development of printing, between the 15th and 16th centuries, stories mentioning Robin Hood multiplied, this character being very popular in England. It was at this time that Robin's friends and enemies appeared: Little John, the merry man who accompanied Robin, a monk who became Brother Tuck in the 19th century, the Sheriff of Nottingham, etc. Robin's place of residence, the county of Nottingham, and his place of action, Sherwood Forest, also appeared at this time. However, although presented as an archer, the hero of the story was still very different from the one we know today. The latter, described as a peasant landowner, a yeoman, robbed the rich on his own account, and did not hesitate to kill, often rich abbots. Robin thus remained close to his counterpart Robot, a rebel challenging authority. Finally, it is at the beginning of the 17th century that the character evolved the most. Thus, the story of Robin goes back in time, not taking place in the 13th century but around 1190, when King Richard the Lionheart took part in the Third Crusade. Prince John became the villain of the story, delegating his orders to the vile Sheriff of Nottingham. Robin was described as stealing from the rich to redistribute his plunder to the poor. The character of Mary Ann, Robin's great love, appeared. The latter was named Marian or Matilda according to the texts. Finally, Robin was endowed with a title of nobility, becoming Robin of Locksley, a fallen lord. He was named Robert, Earl of Huntingdon, in a play performed in London in 1601, or Robert of Fitzooth. It is however in the 19th degree century that Robin was presented as a Saxon lord stripped of his lands by the Norman sovereigns. In the 20th degree century, the character, with the well-established character, evolved little. However, it is from this time that a Saracen, survivor of the Crusades, was added to the number of the merry companions of Robin. In the end, we can see how the character of Robin Hood has evolved over the centuries, each author adapting it to the expectations of the public of his time. Thus, if the existence of a robot having lived in the 13th degree century is undeniable, the latter hardly shares any more common points with his paper counterpart. Let's move on to another historical lie and listen to this. Henry VIII killed all his wives. Wrong. Henry VIII, although he had an impressive number of wives and mistresses, did not have all his wives executed. In fact, he only had 2 killed, as we shall see. Young Henry ascended the throne in April 1509. 2 months later he married Catherine of Aragon, the young widow of his elder brother Arthur. Henry VII, the father of Henry VIII, had wished to bring the crowns of England and Spain closer together. In January 1511, Catherine gave birth to a son, but the latter died quickly. Over the years, the Queen gave birth to several stillborn children, as well as the young Mary. In 1527, Henry VIII's wife was an aging woman, and it was more than likely that she would never give her husband that much desired son. At that time, the King of England had become close to Anne Boleyn, a follower of Catherine of Aragon. Henry VIII then decided to divorce her, which the Pope forbade him to do. The exasperated English sovereign proclaimed in 1531 that he was the sole master of the Church of England. This is how Anglicanism was born. Henry VIII was thus able to divorce, and married Anne Boleyn in May 1533. Anne Boleyn became pregnant and gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. In the years that followed, the new wife of the King of England had a series of miscarriages. Henri VIII then began to get close to Jean Seymour, another following of Catherine of Aragon. In 1536, Anne Boleyn was accused of treason, incest and heresy, and was sentenced to death. Her execution allowed the King of England to marry Joan, his third wife. The latter gave him a son in October 1537, the future Edward VI, but died in childbirth. In 1540, the English sovereign was already in his late 50s. Henry VIII, according to sources at the time, weighed more than 130 kilograms. It was on this date that he married Anne of Cleves, daughter of John III, Duke of Cleves. Henry VIII's aim at that time was to strengthen ties with the Protestant princes of Germany. However, the King of England did not like his fourth wife, which must have been reciprocal, given their great age difference, repudiating her 6 months later. In July 1540, following his new divorce, Henry VIII married Catherine Howard, Anne of Cleves' successor. But the latter was accused of adultery, and executed in February 1542. The following year, in July 1543, the King of England married a sixth wife, Catherine Parr. However, she did not give children to Henry VIII, who died in January 1547. For many decades, the king's repeated marriages were a scandal, as were the many summary executions he ordered. Some authors painted a particularly bleak picture of the monarch, making him a selfish and brutal monster. Some historians even think that he could even be at the origin of the children's account The Bluebeard, in which a cruel old man multiplies female conquests before slitting their throats. However, if Henri VIII appears to us today as an overweight tyrant, we should not forget that he was, at the beginning of his reign, particularly slender. Indeed, the sovereign changed a lot from 1536, which was a difficult year for him. Wounded in the thigh during an equestrian joust, he could not ride a horse or even practice any physical activity. He had to face a Catholic revolt, and Boleyn was probably cheating on him, and he lost his illegitimate son Henry Fitzroy, who died of tuberculosis. Today, although some of his actions inspire horror, Henry VIII is still considered the ruler who transformed medieval England into a modern state. If you like these stories, don't hesitate to put a blue thumb on it. It will refer the chain and give me courage to continue to share new historical facts with you. Come on, it's high time to move on to lie number 3. You want more? If I ask you, John Law invented the banknote. Wrong again. And yes, another historical error. In 1715, the Scotsman John Law de Lauriston was the first to introduce the banknote system in France, with the support of the court. However, if the idea of paper money was a novelty in France, it was already centuries old. Very early in the history of mankind, merchants and bankers, weighed down by the coins they had to carry, came up with the idea of paper money, which was lighter and more practical. Such a system was introduced in China at the beginning of the 7th century, at the time of the Tang dynasty. It should be noted that at that time, this currency had nothing official, remaining similar to a bearer bond. The note indicated the sums that the merchant had deposited in the bank, as well as the location of the bank, in order to proceed with the transaction. This system was made official a few centuries later, at the beginning of the 11th century, during the Song dynasty. This first banknote in history was called jiaozi. It should be noted that already at this time, Chinese sovereigns were forced to fight against counterfeiting. A century later, a new banknote, the huizi, was put into circulation for a larger amount. The Mongols, invading China in the mid-13th century, established the Yuan dynasty, led by Kublai Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan. The latter then established the jiao, a paper money that enjoyed great success, benefiting from a wider distribution than its predecessors. It was through the intermediary of the explorer Marco Polo, who visited the court of Kublai Khan at the end of the 13th century, that Europeans discovered the existence of paper money. At that time, the idea of a banknote distributed by the state marked the merchants and bankers of the city-states of Italy. From the end of the 14th century, they began to use paper money, but in the form of bearer bonds without official character. This is how bills of exchange appeared, facilitating trade and being exchanged throughout Europe. In the Western world, the first banknotes were distributed by the Bank of Stockholm in 1661, which went bankrupt 3 years later, in the 13 colonies, starting in 1690, then in France in 1715. When John Law arrived in France, the country was governed by Philippe d'Orléans, who was in charge of the regency during the minority of Louis XV. At that time, the state coffers were empty, and the debt, colossal, reached nearly £3 billion, the equivalent of about 10 years of revenue. It was then that Law proposed to the regent to replace gold with paper money in order to revive the country's economic activity. Thus Law's system was put in place. Banknotes, lighter and more practical, circulated more easily, reviving the economy. After 1 year, shareholders received dividends of 7%. Law, who had been authorized to open a general bank in 1715, decided to embark on larger operations. To his benefit, he obtained the creation of a Compagnie d'Occident, which was responsible for exploiting the resources of the French territories in North America. In 1719, he also had the rights to the Compagnie Française des Indes Orientales ceded to him, thus reaping substantial profits. Appointed Comptroller General of Finance in January 1720, Law noted that some shareholders were speculating on the price of shares. He decided to put in place coercive measures, prohibiting the possession of more than 500 pounds of precious metals per household, in order to encourage the spread of paper money. However, in the summer of 1720, the law system went bankrupt, and shares continued to fall. Many private individuals tried to get rid of their notes, while at the same time the kingdom's greats entered the bank to withdraw large amounts of gold. Following this event, riots broke out, forcing the establishment to go bankrupt. At the end of the year, the banknotes were abolished, the system was abandoned, and Law was forced into exile. Following the failure of Law's system, the idea of paper money was abandoned, reappearing only during the French Revolution, in the form of assignats. However, this new system was also a failure, suffering from hyperinflation which ruined many savers. Thus, it was not until 1803 that the first banknotes were issued and made official by the state. Voila! It's over for this time. Thanks for your listening and support. So thanks for your thumbs, your comments and subscribes. See you for a next video and have a good day.